virtual edition. It is our goal that each session is about an hour in length. However, we may go a little longer, we may go shorter. My name is David Stevens. I'm the Director of Academic Activities for UIL. Also helping with this session is Linda Munoz, Administrative Assistant for UIL Academics, who many of you get emails from, but you don't always get to see her, so now's your chance. This session is the literary criticism for new coaches. Our presenter is Mark Bernier. Mark has been the contest director for this for many years, at least all the years that I've been involved in UIL. He's one of our most dedicated UIL servants that I know. He hosts multiple district meets, 2 region meets. He is always at state meet, and students and their success and what they do in this contest is his utmost purpose of why he's involved. So it's great to have you, Mark. Thank you very much for being willing to share your wisdom and knowledge with our attendees in this new format of Capital Conference.
Thank you, David. Thank you for the intro, and thank you for letting me say that this is new to me, definitively so. So patience as I get used to looking at a monitor or a camera, please, out there. And I'm not used to sitting, so I'll be kind of moving around more than I should be. But my attention will be to your questions. As David has said, please interrupt me. As David says, I've been doing this for a while. I've enjoyed it all along, and it's another year. We're going to look at, in this session, the contest itself. I'm going to speak as though none of you know anything about it, and hopefully my overview will help toward your understanding it, but one never knows how clear one comes across with a concept, which is why I asked David to tell y'all, please interrupt at any given time so that that clarification is indeed clarification. So here we go. The literary contest. The literary criticism contest is not so much criticism as it is analysis by way of criticism through analysis. So we look at literature, we look at the tools with which we work in order to address literature in a manner that, well, it's confined to multiple choice questions. And I usually say in a face-to-face, that's a bit of an obscenity. That is addressing poetry and coming up with an answer of some sort, and I have to come up with the distractors. And that pretty much doesn't completely rule out the subjective encounter with the literature, but it certainly narrows it. But that's the nature of testing in our world since 1792 when we started this sort of thing. So the test itself, the contest itself, is a 65-item objective encounter with 3 aspects of being someone who enjoys reading. There's a 4th part, which is an essay, and that is a required essay. We'll talk about that at some length. Again, it's 65 questions, multiple choice, 5 options. 1 is an answer, 4 are distractors, and it's divided, that is, those 65 objective questions divided into 3 parts. The first part is a 30-item section. Each of those items is worth 1 point. The second part is a 20-item section, each item worth 2 points. And the balance, 15 items worth 2 points each. Add that all up, you have 100 points. A question I always get about this time, in contrast to some of the other UIL tests, you were required as a contestant to answer all 65 questions. If you don't answer, it's counted wrong. So it's a subtraction of 2 points per item, parts 2 and 3, and a subtraction of 1 point per item, section 1. So guessing is not a bad idea. I'll say at this point, as you should emphasize all the way through your practices, that we're working with capital letters in the answer sheet. We do not want to have any difficulties between the A's and the D's, that sort of thing. So we'll look at section 1 real quick. I'll take a question or two if they come that way, David.
Sure, I don't have any questions yet, but I will jump in there.
Thank you. Part 1 is 30 items. It's comprised of 30 items. I see it in 3 parts. Part 1 has 3 parts. We'll go through it, the more difficult part in some ways first. The 8 of the questions have to do with authors and their works, often defined by the prizes they have received. In the back of the literature handbook, the Handbook to Literature, 12th edition, is a truncated listing of Nobel Prize winners, Nobel Prize for Literature, and a truncated listing of Pulitzer Prizes for fiction, for poetry, and for drama. The edition, the most recent edition, which is the 12th edition, this not being a STEM contest, the publishers are not that interested in republishing this. I take that to be the nicest answer they can give us. We are working with an older edition, 12th edition. It is the most recent edition. And these lists to which I've just referred, to which 8 items in the first 30, among the first 30 pertain, only go to 2010. As of last year, you will find on the reading list itself, which David will put up in the chat room, or you have found already on the website, URLs to the Pulitzer listing for fiction, for poetry, for drama, and a URL to the full listing of the Nobel Prize for Literature. That adds another 10 or 11 years of, well, options for me to throw at your contestants. To make that less onerous, I have over the past few years reduced that number from about 12 to 8, which is to say, in the back of the Handbook to Literature or on that URL regarding the Nobel Prize winners for literature, there will only be one question. So you can do the math there. You take it to Vegas and decide not to study your Pulitzer Prize winners, or your, in this case, Nobel Prize winners. That's just 1 point. But it is that we are approaching this fullness of enjoying our grandfathers telling us stories, our aunts telling us stories, which are codified in this literature that we read. These are not old, dead people. These are people who have lived lives that have something to say to us now, and we're reading their stuff. And some of them have been recognized with these prizes, and to know of that sort of thing is a good aspect of it. And historically, since 1987, part of what we do. So in short, 4 lists in the back of the handbook that are extended on the websites to which I've referred, and they are on the URL. The URLs are on the reading list each year these last 2 years. 1 question, 1 item from the Nobel Prize for Literature, 1 from the Pulitzer for Fiction, 1 for the Pulitzer for Poetry, 1 for the Pulitzer for Drama. So that's 4 from those lists specifically, which, if your notes are keeping up with my rattling on, that's only half of the 8 that have to do with this part of part 1. Again, 8 questions have to do something with the authors and their authorship. 4 of them I've gone through, representing their acclaim in the world, our acclaim of them in the world through the Pulitzer and the Nobel. The other 4 can be drawn from a couple of sources. The main source is another, if you will, appendix in the back of the handbook. And it is an outline to literary history. Now, I'll throw this in there. It's pretty obvious, and it's something with which I'm working to expand, but slowly, as some of you, I've talked to some of you about. This is an Anglophone literature contest. In the back of the 11th and in back of the 12th edition of the Handbook to Literature, we've gone to 3 columns. One is British literature, the other is American literature, and of late we've thrown in the world literature column. For the most part, the world literature is not there for me to pull questions from. Now, I say that hesitantly. We cannot do American literature, we can't do British literature without some referencing to Dante, Petrarch, Homer, those guys who are not British or American, but have certainly made their mark in our world culturally, not exclusively literary. So for the next 4 questions, the 4 of the 8 that I haven't addressed, the main sourcing is indeed that outline of literary history in the back of the handbook, wherein you'll find chronologically British and American literature represented by both authors and titles. Now, it's not a exhaustive list. I sometimes say I think it was put together by drunk graduate students. You go to the Pulitzer Prizes or you go to the Nobel Prizes, you'll find a name and a work, but that work might not show up in the outline of literary history for whatever reason. So it is that I will pick an author who shows up in the outline of literary history, and I will find one that has 2 or 3 novels or collections of poetry or plays represented in that chronological listing in the appendix in the back of the handbook to literature. And not a gotcha kind of thing, did you study everything, but work with the canon, I will. The authors that are familiar to those of us who have spent some time. And I know that's a little difficult for the coaches who have freshmen and sophomore. And it's now a little bit more difficult for those who have juniors and seniors in that we're doing AP and we're doing dual credit rather than what traditionally we have done junior level, the American canon, the American survey, or the British canon by way of the British survey. But they should be recognize these authors in the outline of literary history as the predominating, there's a bad word there, predominant, or at least in terms of the canon, the more representative of that tradition. So I might ask, which of the following 5 titles is not a Dickens novel? Or conversely, I might ask, who is the author of these 4 or 5 titles? Most of those titles will be found in the outline to literary history, but there is omission from time to time, including perhaps having won a prize for one of these novels. Let's call it a novel or a collection of poetry or a drama, and it doesn't show up in that, but I will include that particular title to make it more recognizable among the coaches, but especially the contestants. So it is that 8 of the questions of the first 30, 1 point each, looks at authors and authorship in terms of what they've written, either familiarity with the novels or the plays or familiarity with the authors themselves, so that that sort of, I guess it's trivia to some people, that kind of knowledge is rewarded with a point if one knows it. Another way to address these authors is to look at them in terms of groups, whether we're talking about a cultural group, a literary group, a historical group. What comes to mind are the metaphysical poets, the Elizabethan playwrights, the angry young men kind of stuff, the Harlem Renaissance. And there are authors who are associated with those particular movements, those particular groups, those particular cultural gatherings that appear also in those outlines, those chronological outlines at the back of the book, British and American particularly. So you have in that outline of literary history a chronology that is divided up into the different movements, the different time periods of literature. So those 8 questions might find me asking which one of these 5 poets is not a metaphysical poet, that kind of question. In amongst those 8 questions, there might be something that my predecessor enjoyed doing, and it's a lot of fun for me. Which one of these particular authors would not be found sitting, I don't know, in a tea salon or a coffee salon or a chocolate salon, or sitting together in London with the Bloomsbury group, so that if Chaucer shows up in a listing that has Virginia Woolf, there's a problem there in terms of anachronism. And so a recognition on the part of the contestant of groupings of, of authors across the timeline. So it's not going to be possible that Geoffrey Chaucer and William Shakespeare, unless they both got in the TARDIS with Doctor Who, they're not going to sit down and have a cup of tea together. I'm going to say one more before we move on and hope for a couple of questions. One more aspect of this. I did, in my example just now, offer a not. 3 of my questions in the first 30, 3 of my questions, 3 of my items among the first 30 one-pointers are always not. Who is not? What is not? That gives me a little bit more freedom to work with some of the other items in the handbook to literature, some of which are very difficult to find, legitimate distractors. So there will always be a not question on each of the first three pages, 1 each page among the first 30. Time for a question or 2, please. Okay.
We have anything in the chat box, but don't hesitate to unmute yourself and ask a question if you have one out there in the virtual world.
Thank you, David. So I referred to 30 items in part 1. I've referred to 8. That leaves 22. I recognize that the handbook is a discussion of terms that can be associated with how we deal with literature directly, things like alliteration, assonance, hyperbole, that sort of approach, the metaphors, the metonymy. And then there's another set of terms that have to do with literary history. Those are, as I've already kind of referenced, the metaphysical poets, the Bloomsbury group, the Restoration age, these terms that have more to do with grouping in historical context rather than terms that we use to analyze, that is, to bring a critical analysis to a work of literature itself. So it is that of the 22 items not pertaining directly to the literature in terms of authors and authorship, 22 items, 11 of those have to do with literary terms usually, and please give me some leeway with that usually, and 11 of them have to do with historical aspects of the presentation of our human story through the literature that we value so much. Those could be items, questions that deal with genre. Now with genre, good people, I see that as both a literary term and historically defined. For instance, if we're going to work with epics, sometimes I see that as a historical term because we don't do epics very much anymore. That's the old Homer stuff and with the folk epic and all the way at Beowulf somehow. And then you get into the art epics with Milton. Still, it is a historically, in terms of chronology, historically based sort of approach. The aesthetic is no longer with us, but it is also a genre into which we might find ourselves, well, the kids use the term all the time, right? That's an epic fail. The terminology is still with us, so it might be, I see that kind of term as falling into either category as I've delineated it, not the 8 with the authors and the authorship, but it could be either among the 11 items I put on the page that had to do with literary terms or 11 items that had to do with time periods, cultural groups, literary expression in terms of the young agrarians, the groups that named themselves or they were named by others who had no particular love for them for any number of reasons. The Kaler group, the Graveyard School of Poetry, those are elemental in the 22 items I'm talking about now. So all told, that's 30 one-point items in part 1, all of which find foundational purpose in putting together a handbook here that we can carry around as one of the terms in the handbook, a wade mecum, V-A-D-E, mecum. I'll carry with me a handbook, and we haven't gone virtual with this yet, so it is, we can open this up and highlight and make all kinds of personal notes. Out of that come 30 items, but I'll remind you the extension by way of the URLs listed on the reading list for this year that take us into 2020 for the Pulitzers and the Nobel Prize for Literature. Is that a question, David?
Yes. A question about reviewing timelines. Do you suggest we start chronologically with reviewing timelines, especially with our underclassmen?
You're not going to like my answer because it's going to be 2 or 3 answers. I'll answer it in that with the underclassmen, you know you're going to hang on to them all the way, and you know that this is going to be, dare I say, easier for them once they've done 2 or 3 years of this, both the studying and the immersing into the handbook and through the literature. But more pragmatically, I would suggest, because something I haven't said yet and something I do have an intent to do, and it doesn't come to fruition in any full-blown way, but I'm attentive to our reading list. So if we have a poet out of the 19th century, we have a playwright out of the 17th century, we have a novelist out of the 20th century, chronologically, there's an importance there because they indeed represent more fully than just the literature they're writing, but the times, the full milieu. So you might have a focus on the time periods that Arthur Miller, we're working with him this year, Joseph Conrad, a little bit earlier in the 20th century, surely an echo in some ways of the 19th century, and the poetry there of Wordsworth, which is transitional also there in the middle of the 19th century. So 19th century might be a good place to start. But in that what is the line that everybody in some way modifies? We're all standing on the shoulders of giants, and that reflects a necessity, I think, to understand the timeline chronologically. So to start at the beginning, to let the students know that there is a long history here. Sometimes by way of our media, we forget that there is a lot of time since, let's say, 1776. That's 2.5 centuries, and things were done very differently there. Past is a different country. So my short answer is focus on the time periods that the authors that your kids will be reading this year represent, but do not forget about as you build literary critics, the timeline itself. Thank you. I don't think I emphasized. What I try to do is, if Arthur Miller represents something, if Joseph Conrad represents something, if William Wordsworth represents something, I will try to have questions like that representing that sort of stuff in part 1, as well as part 2, which is specific to their writing, and there might be an echo in part 3, indeed in part 4 also. So focusing first where the writers are, and this time around it seems to be 19th century stuff into the 20th century, and then don't forget about the linearity of it. Thank you very much, David.
That's all in the chat box so far.
Okay, any other questions on part 1? Okay, that timing is good enough for me in that we are halfway through. Part 2 and part 3, the items are worth 2 points each. Part 2 refers each year to a specific body of literature. This year, it's Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness on the reading list that David might be putting in the chat box. It is Arthur Miller's Death of a Salesman and a representative selection of William Wordsworth's poetry. Sulphur Springs, Gail sent me a note saying that one of the Wordsworth's poems is not in one of the anthologies. That's on me. My trying to find anthologies in quantity enough, representing some of the poetries that we're doing, oftentimes, well, twice in 5 years I've missed it, so I run guilty here. But The poetry is also found on the web, which is to say, if you look on the reading list, I believe there are 2 Wordsworth poems, books, or I'm misremembering that. Somehow during the middle of our finding a book that would work for us, an anthology that would work for us, I was told that I could use the English production, the United Kingdom, or the United States printing, and apparently they might be different. Nonetheless, all the poems can be found on the web. Joseph Conrad, wow, we're in a new world of sudden. I start picking a selection as early as July or August of a given year. I'm looking at selections for 22 already. So before everything kind of changed in our world in many different ways, it was time in my book for Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, a perennial favorite, but one that certainly is going to bring up new, dare I say, levels of conversation in the classroom. I've rethought it, and I think we're going to stay with it. I will be careful with my questions, but I do not wish it that the context of the novel fail to engender discussion in the classroom while you're working with your lit critters. So Conrad's Heart of Darkness, there will be about 6 questions on each of the tests that I write. I write invitational A, I write invitational B, I write the district, the region, and the state test. So 6 times 5, that's about 30 questions I pull out of the novel. A lot of what I do with the questions can be understood by how I approach the drama piece. So let's start with that one. Arthur Miller's Death of a Salesman, once again, timely. My items, and you can see this in the chat room, there's a list, a link to the district test from last year. And you can see that I take from the literary piece itself. With the play, it's real easy. That is, I pull dialogue, and the students, the contestants, should be able to recognize who's saying what to whom and why. It is the case that in the hyperbolic and telescopic nature of literature as it's put on the stage, Shakespeare and no one else wants you to forget who's been introduced. So everything's kind of reinforced, and you get an idea of who and what can say, much as the kiddos can determine who and what of their own classmates, their own peer group would dare say what this person just said. So not unlike a play, so to the novel, your characters are, unlike real life, pretty predictable. So I feel very comfortable pulling a conversation out of either the play or the novel and having that recognized in terms of either what's being said or who's being said, who's being addressed by whom. Is that a question, David?
All clear in the chat box so far.
Okay, don't have my glasses on. So it is that these items of 20, 6 will be for the play, 6 will address the novel, and it will be questions I kind of want to pride myself on that cannot be answered if you only read the Cliff's Notes or whatever modern mutation, I'll use that term, Cliff's Notes have taken, Spark Notes and everything else that's online. It is a recognition that on my part that the novel itself, the play itself should be read by the student, by the contestant, not once, but several times, maybe each time with a different color pen. So he or she is annotating this work of literature, and it's becoming very familiar to him or her. These questions in the invitational in the district are fairly simple questions relative to what I will come at them with regional and state. And that's best explained, I think, by looking at the poetry. The poetry this season is the poetry of William Wordsworth. He loves the sonnet, hint, hint. You might start in your timeline with sonneteers and all that sort of thing. That question of the chronology and discussion of the various types of sonnet. He is a political guy. He is someone whose approach to the world changed as he got older. So there's quite a variety of stuff. There's quite a variety of poetry from which to pick. Thus, there are about 12 or 15 titles on the reading list. Early in the season, especially the invitationals, but including the district, I will tend to ask mechanical questions about the poetry. And that's the sort of thing that I'm looking at in the novel and the play also. They are questions that if we've spent time, especially with the youngsters, the freshmen and the sophomores, the underclassmen, you're in the terms of the poetry, this is a metaphor, this is a simile, look at this metonymy, this is hyperbole here. What is this rhyme scheme? Those basic kind of bad word here, only word, mechanical aspects of the presentation. Back to the literature in terms of the novel and the drama. If we've read through those once or twice, we should be able to understand the interaction, the very human interaction, and what it is being conveyed without getting into the nuance that maybe, by way of example, Shakespeare handles with his poetic expression, that is the manner that the Elizabethan world was used to, and we find it, that's not English. Yes, it's very much English, but it's not our idiom, it's not our aesthetic. So that in the poetry and in the play and in the novel, the questions I will draw and place for your contestants to look at will be simpler questions than what I will ask at region and state. Questions that have to do with understanding what's going on as we move through the literature itself without maybe having sat down and thought about it and revisited it. That will come a little bit later at region and state. Questions, David?
Nothing in our chat box.
We have a couple of minutes here. How easy is it for everybody to go to that sample test, a district test, and take a look at a question or two?
It is the last link that's in the chat box. All you need to do is click on that link and it should bring up the district test in another window.
And if you're looking through those 20 questions, the first 6 are for the novel. The first 6 are for the drama. The second 6 are for the novel, and the final 8 are for usually 2 poems that will appear on the test itself. Long time ago, we used to not put the poetry on the page, and that was difficult for the contestants. So it is that the contestants will have immediate reference to the poetry. If it's a longer poem, it might be excerpted. If it's excerpted, knowledge of the full poem is what I am banking on. That is, these poems Wordsworth has written, and I just excerpt maybe 20 lines of it. It's excerpted for instance, during the district test, looking at some mechanics of the poetic line. But to understand the poem in toto, I feel comfortable that your contestants will, your lit critters will, because they have looked at these poems all season. Any questions coming from anybody about those 20 questions, questions 31 through whatever that is, 50?
Catherine has a question. There's about the questions for part 3. There's 6 drama plus 6 novel plus 8 poetry, correct?
That's part 2. Yes. Now, I better clear that up. That's the way it's been the last few years. I better put it in more general terms, Catherine. If I start out with 6 questions for the drama, 6 questions for the novel, and 8 questions for the poetry, I will hang with that all through the season. If for whatever reason I start with 7 for the drama and 6 for the novel and 7 for the poetry, I will hang with that all season, excuse me. But it's usually 6, 6, and 8. Which comes to be usually 4 questions for each of the 2 poems that usually appear, again, usually on each of the tests. Again, by way of clarification, some of the vendors putting together tests, especially when we get to part 2, yeah, Catherine, they are not easy questions, but they are questions that if, I'll tell a story here. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. If we're reading the play, for instance, and we get to know our our characters very well in that play, we should be able to recognize them even outside that play. So I'm not sure which question you're looking at. I don't have a test in front of me. They are questions, they are items that I pull knowing that, and this is a district test you're looking at, that the questions on the invitationals have pointed the contestant in the direction I'm going, and that if we've read the play 3 or 4 times, you should have, whether it seems like generally they're over the students' heads, if we're familiar with the goings on in the play, the very human aspects of the play, how people interact with one another, especially these that have been conjured up before us on the page or on the stage, as it were, I think they'll be a lot easier. Yes, ma'am.
I have another here that the formula of questions will be sent when of 668 or 767.
I will determine that with the first invitational. If I were going to Vegas, it would be 668.
All right, thanks for clarifying. That's all we got in the box for now.
I had something that came up and I dropped it. So we'll move on to part 3, if there are no more questions on part 2. Part 3 is, I usually say in a face-to-face and hoping everybody understands this fully, my favorite part. And it's not because of the poems I put there, it's I have to find poems to be able to put into part 3 and get 15 questions. Now, real quick on the poem thing. My predecessor, Fred, I think twice over the 22 or 3 years that he did it, and I only twice since I've been doing it these last 11 or 12 years, have found prose pieces to put in part 3. It is counterproductive in many ways. One, if it's a prose piece, in contrast to poetry, all the things I can ask, all the things that you teach are not jammed into one kind of artifact. You got 2 or 3 chapters going on before the next poetic or rhetorical occurrence that I could ask a question about occurs. So more than likely, you'll see a prose piece once every 4 or 5 years. Most of the time, it's poetry. And because it's a time test, 90 minutes for the 65 objective questions, and writing an essay about which we will speak very soon, I try to get as many questions for each of the poems that I put on the page in part 3. Thus, there's usually 4 poems, sometimes 3 poems, and a short sort of, do you recognize this as a haiku or a senru? Is this an epigram? Or so it is, you have the students, the contestants looking at 3 poems. Here's where I suggest forgetting that this is beautiful literature and ask your contestants, your lit critters, to read the poems second. That is, read the questions first, take a highlighter. If the question asks, what's happening in line 4, go to line 4, highlight that. So when the student goes back, the contestant goes back, the literary critic goes back and looks at the poem in full, if that's what he or she decides to do, it's in a context. It's in a context. Got a question, Dave? Okay, so it is that I'm suggesting here that this literature that I spend a little bit of time looking for, literature in the way of poems that I can draw multiple choice questions out of. And so it ends up being a piece of literature that is good stuff that I think is level playing ground across 6 classifications and 4 years of being in high school for the seniors who are working on this for their last time, perhaps. Poems that you've not seen before. Try to stay away from the poems that show up in anthologies that the students might have encountered. So it is, everybody's coming to this on a level playing field, that there are as few poems as I can extract 15 questions from, thus there's 3 or 4 poems. And once again, as is in part 3, the questions get more difficult as we get into region and state. 15 questions, 2 points each. This is, as part 3 suggests, ability in literary criticism. You're coming to it, and which isn't to say that the answer to one of your questions or a lot of help to one of the items in part 3 isn't to be found in part 1, where I might have asked by way of offering a definition, what is this term? So in very simple construct here, it might be, I'll ask what kind of sonnet is this in part 3? If I ask that question in part 2 and you don't know, it's because we haven't been studying the sonnets, Wordsworth sonnets. You should know that before you come to part 2. But in part 3, if you come across a sonnet and I ask what kind of sonnet it is, it might well be that there is a definition of a particular sonnet that might help the contestant already on the test in part 1. So part 3, 2 points each, builds on the rote sort of learning that you might find your lit critters doing for part 1. The certainly in-depth encounter with the literature of part 2, which will become more and more in-depth as the season goes on, past invitational, into district, and finally into region and state. And then part 3, where in a sense we are on our own. Again, more than likely poetry, and a good chance echoing some of what we've done during the season in part 2. Part 4 is a tie-breaking essay. 2 aspects of this in terms of the pragmatic concerns for your student. 1, if you don't offer a sincere essay in response to the essay prompt, as you might see there in the chat room, district essay prompt, you're disqualified. 2, the only time anybody reads some of this beautiful stuff is if there happens to be an objective tie for 2nd place, for 4th place, 3rd place, or for 1st place. And I've been at state where we've had ties for 2nd and 3rd, so we're reading a lot of essays. The essay is very important. I'd like you to emphasize to your contestants, to your lit critters, you do not know who you're going to tie with. He or she might be someone who is also involved in ready writing. You need to take seriously, young lit critter, the opportunity to write about the piece of literature as directed by the prompt, as though you're going up against someone who's taking it seriously. There are no definitive parameters for the answer, but it is the case, as I say in the directions, you'll see at the top of, I guess, page 9, that it's as though the student is being asked to write an essay for someone who reads essays for his or her living. So a title, an introduction of some note, a body with support evidence from the poem. And again, it's usually a poem, as it's usually a poem in part 3, and then something in the way of conclusion. Again, 90 minutes. So it is that we don't have much time to write. I suggest that as a student gets the test and is given the get-go to open the test, go to part 4. Ease into the test by reading the poem against the prompt and put that on the back burner, as Asimov says. So as the contestants doing part 1 and part 2 and part 3, you might have little epiphanies going on, and that student can take that and flip that to page 9 and write little notes, thinking about that poem in the background as he or she's doing part 1, part 2, part 3. Meanwhile, the video will be available next week sometime. Meanwhile, what I've done these past 6 or 7 years for invitational and for district, the poem in part 4 for the tie-breaking, you got to answer it or you're disqualified essay, is a poem from the poet on the reading list. This year, William Wordsworth. Now get this clear, please. It's not one of the poems on the list. It's one of his other poems. If we're going to spend that much time with William Wordsworth for the season, during invitational and district, I'm going to offer a William Wordsworth poem for that student to feel comfortable with. And then when we get to region and state, it's going to be a poem that perhaps no one has ever seen. That's an exaggeration, but one that I feel everybody on a level playing field is tackling for the first time in this context. So 90 minutes, 65 objective questions, first 30, 1 point each, next 35, 2 points each. That adds up to 100. If there's any kind of tie, we read the tiebreakers, or those students with the same objective score. Gosh, if we have 4 students with an 86, we read 4 essays, and those essays are ranked against those of that group. No points are added to or taken from. We go with the objective score only, and we rank them according to the manner in which, the quality in which the essay is addressing the prompt, not necessarily the quality of the writing. Not many of us can write well in first draft, and many of the students who get caught up in this particular contest are first generation English speakers. A lot of Vietnamese, a lot of Hispanics, and the idioms sometimes do not come across as well as they should. We're not grading the writing, we're grading the analysis. That's me, David.
Right. We did have a question about the video, and we are hoping that we have those up this week. We're still doing a few checks and balances as to what's possible and what we can provide, and make sure we're not violating copyright and all sorts of good stuff like that. So, question about Lit Chris? Oh, go ahead, Mark.
Let me remind everybody, and because of this lockdown, I can't get on campus. I haven't seen my office since March 4th. No, that's not true, since March 3rd. And I don't work from home as well. I'm out in the country and everything's tentative at best. My reminder is that on the website, the Literary Criticism website, there's a study aid, and it is not up to date. I have not finished last year's work. It is a listing of all the terms that I have tested in parts 1 and some of part 3. Those that are specific to the writing in the reading list, and some that are specific to things like tone and theme that are not general terms that cannot be found in the handbook itself, are not listed there. So there are probably 45 items from each of the tests I've written over the past 10 or 12 years listed in a study aid, a master list of terms. So and it's not as easy as, in fact, I was going through my email for the first time the other day and I found that I've not answered somebody. You can ask me for a master list of the terms in Word rather than the PDF that you see in front of you, perhaps. And I will send that to you and you can do what you want with it. You can, for instance, pull the metaphor and you'll find that oftentimes I use 3 distractors, but sometimes another 2 distractors. And you look at the 50 times I've asked about metaphor in part 1, and you come up with whatever the math is there, the 70 or 80 distractors it couldn't be that many. There are 20 or 30 different distractors I've used in terms of the metaphor, and that can be a study guide. There's also a listing of all the poems that I've used. I'm a year behind on that one also. Thank you, David.
What's the recommendation for grading the essays? Is it just 3 of the Lit Crit coaches grading in the room that read the essays for the tiebreaker?
That's a difficult one a lot of the times. You're hoping that no one pulls, no offense to bus drivers, unless they're going to be like me when I retire and drive buses, and I did a little bit of this. But you hope you have 3 coaches who have no vested interest in the particular students whose essays are being ranked. You'd like to have it at 3. You want to have them out of earshot, so if they feel like they have to talk to one another, you don't have coaches horning in on the discussion or approaching afterwards. I've seen that happen. So you find 3 people who know what they're doing and 3 people who care what they're doing, and that might well be the bus driver for all I know, but I'm hoping that it's 3 English teachers. Circumstance has it different. And I would say at district, I think I can get away with saying this, in the UIL philosophy, we're all there for the students. And if you all know each other well enough, and dare I say, in a very sharp sort of use of the word, trust each other to come up with the best to represent the district, moving on to represent onto regional, I would not preclude someone who is authentically divorced from his or her own student objectively, so that the right one gets picked.
What is the best way you would recommend to help students prepare when I only have them for 30 minutes after school?
Boy, you're being optimistic. I hope you get to work with them 30 minutes face to face and all that. In the years that I did that, and where I was most successful, it wasn't me. I tell stories of 2 students who came to me there at the end of their first semester as seniors. And Bernier, what can I do? I don't want to be in a class. What can I do? I'm interested in this stuff. I said, look, crit, but they were on their own in terms of enthusiasm. I had no time. I certainly met with them as individuals and promoted and gave them direction, but they ate up the handbook. They ate up the literature. One came in 5th place at state after starting Lit Crit in January of her senior year, and another came in 1st place at state starting in December of her senior year. Both of them were online to be an autodidact. So my success has been with students who are really interested in this. So what do you do with 30 minutes? Somehow you build the interest and let the interest take over there. If you get them studying stuff they don't want to study, they're not going to buy into it. But if you find something that they really like and you emphasize that and they're really good at that, you can branch out from there. But that's a tough one, especially for 1As to 4As. The 5As and 6As, traditionally they've had classes set aside and teachers with stipends, or that's part of their assignment. So you got to know your students well enough to know what's best. And if you can get Pizza Hut to contribute a pizza, or get somebody to buy you handbooks instead of buying the football team, whatever they buy the football team in town, that's the best way. It's a
Great.
tough one.
That's all the questions we have in the chat box. Anybody have any? This is your last chance. Going, gone. Or feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question to Mark that way. I think you were thorough and they're good.
Let me give an alternative email address for a couple of reasons. It won't be up until probably September or August, but MWBERN at att.net.
Repeat that again, Mark.
MWBERN at att.net. That way, if I'm having trouble getting into my institution's website, and I've had trouble over the summer, had more trouble during our online teaching this past spring, there's and so you can ask a question that way.
Next week's session, will it cover the literature?
But no. Next, though I'll take a question or two about the literature, but we're only doing 2 sessions. Next week we will have on PowerPoint slides, and I'll have in that chat room a link to poetry. We will practice explicating poetry so it's better understood how I find multiple choice questions out of poetry to put on the page for primarily section 3 and part of section 2.
Do you have any recommendations or ideas of what we could do for remote learning practice when we're not seeing our kids in class and we're only seeing them online?
The best I can offer, even if I knew what the heck I was talking about, either through David's World there at UIL, you can pull down test, or I can't guarantee my access to my tests. Again, they're at my institution, not at my house, but pull old tests or go to that poetry list that I have on the UIL LitCrit webpage and look at the poetry that I've used in section 3 and section 2 in the past, pull that down off the web and just have the kids do 2 things. Find questions, what is this? This word rhymes with this word, I think. What kind of rhyme is that? And another way of looking at it is, in terms of the tie-breaking essay, read a poem and write a paragraph about that poem. And then they can respond to you. I mean, they can send it your way and you can respond to them over this virtual feed we're doing.
Great. We also had some recommendations about looking at Quizlet, which is an app that I just recently learned about this summer. And there are things that people have prepared that they share, and you're more than welcome to get those on the Quizlet. It's a free app that you download, and you can download things for free. That's
a very good idea. I know some coaches who do that. I'll say that I do not look at Quizlet. I do not look at SparkNotes. I do not want any kind of influence in my questioning. If it happens to be a question that's already on Quizlet, that's the way it is. But as long as I can still think, I want to still think. And so my experience vicariously through other coaches being happy with Quizlet, providing just what you've described, I'd forgotten about. So thank you to whoever contributed that. Quizlet's a good place to go.
Great. And then there was a question about when our next session is. That's in the chat box for everybody. It is next Thursday, July the 23rd at 2 p.m. That's the poetry explication session. We've had several requests about trying to persuade you to do a workshop that would discuss the literature. It's really helpful for me to talk to the kids about the links you see. I'd like that too, me too. So what we know we're going to have to do more than likely is a virtual student activities conference session. So maybe Mark, you'll consider doing something about your literature that you typically do during student activities conferences for one of those sessions. So we get that in this fall. Does that work for you?
That works for me, David. That works for all 7 or 8 who asked, and all 7 or 8 or 9 or 100 that expected it. I'd love to get that done at however we work the virtual student activity conferences activities.
Perfect. Very good. That would be amazing, Jennifer, right? So, well, great. If we don't have any other questions, then we're going to go ahead and stop the recording.